Tim Schumacher. Welcome to Build a Sell Radio.
Hello. Good to be there.
Yeah, it's great to have you on this latest edition of this Inside the Mind of an Acquirer. I know you've built businesses. You've started them from scratch. You've sold them. You've been an investor. Now, of course, you're an acquirer with SaaS Group. And it's in that context I wanted to have this conversation to really try to get inside your head for our listeners, some of whom are SaaS companies, but as we just talked about before we hit record, many of them are in different industries, but they would have one sort of kind of unifying theme, which is they want to build a company to sell. They want to build a business of value that an acquirer will one day appreciate and pay top dollar for. So it's in that context I wanted to kind of ask you about your journey on becoming an acquirer and what you look for and those sorts of things. So let's start with sort of how you became an acquirer. It's not the kind of thing you just become overnight. So what was your journey to becoming an acquirer?
Well, I was an entrepreneur first. I was a coder when I was a teenager, coded my first software, sold it like basically in boxes, like you sold software back then. And then I started my first business, a company called Cedo.com, is a domain business. There we sold domain names. Obviously, that was the first gold rush of the internet. And with that, probably that was the first touch point because, you buy a domain, you also buy domains attached with websites. And so we got into this business of acquisitions as well. And then I sold Cedo myself. I sold it to a big internet conglomerate, kind of the equivalent of GoDaddy in Europe, a company called United Internet. And I had money on my hands. And then I did what a lot of people did after an exit. Some you could spend, some I invested into angel investments, which is what I did. Some of that went well, others not. But then I really wanted to get back into the game. But I thought, hey, there are so many great projects out there. Why should I build something from scratch, from 0 to 1, if I'm actually probably better at taking something which is there and take it from 1 to 10? And I started dabbling with this. And just a few years later, I'm actually a serial acquirer. And we build a whole machine on that with our SaaS Group, where we acquire SaaS companies. And I love it because I actually love buying projects and products and companies and taking them to the next level. When there's something somebody built who is a great builder of an MVP product, has first revenues, maybe $1 million or $2 million or something, but doesn't want to do this further. And I've learned really over the years that there are two types of people. There are the people who are really those early builders, and there are people who like to scale. And very often those are very different personalities. And I'm the latter. And that's kind of how I started SaaS Group and how I became a serial acquirer.
But you've done both. You've
Yes.
started and you've grown. So you've been a 0 to 1 guy, and you're also a 1 to 10 person, to use Peter Thiel kind of.
True. Yeah.
I'd be curious to know, I guess, why could you do it and others can't, I guess is my question. What is the skill set that you have or the background that you have because again, listeners of this show would be like, well, what's Tim so smart about that he can go start and grow a business? Why do I have to get relegated to just starting a business and pass it over to Tim when it reaches $1 million or $2 million? What is the skill set that you have that others don't, that enables you to go from a couple million in revenue to 10 or 20? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I don't know if I have that skill set to build something again. I heard some great stats the other day that the failure rate of second-time entrepreneurs is 70%. And it's only slightly lower than the failure rate of entrepreneurs overall, which I think is 80%. Because the first time, sure, I was 23 when I started my first business. I was super hungry. We also had the right complementary team and everything. And yes, I built the company from 0 to 300 people. We took it public, later sold it. I went through the full journey. Would I want to go back now to really dabble with a product from 0 just for 2 years? I'm not sure. But if there is something there, I know what to do. And there are a lot of other people who can do that very first step and do that super well. And I'm not sure if I could do it again today. And I think many founders are like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, once you've experienced, the war of or the fog of war of actually starting,
Right.
it doesn't sound too appealing at the end. What's the business model that you have? So we've done interviews with Valsoft, who has sort of like a kind of a Constellation software light,
Yeah.
model. We've done interviews with venture capitalists. We've done interviews with private equity acquirers. So maybe just help me understand, what's the business model that you're pursuing?
Yeah. So our business model is definitely closest to Valsoft or Constellation, just that we would say that we're the more modern form. We look for mostly product-led growth, SaaS companies, a bit more modern one, not super vertical niche things like the other folks. We're definitely not a VC. You could call us a micro PE. So our model is very PE-like. We acquire the entire company. The founders stay on board for a transition period, or they leave, or they stay on for longer. We don't mind either. We love to work with people for longer, but also we've had people who are like, here are the keys and I'm out in 4 weeks. I'm burned out. It's like, I can't do this any longer. So we can work with either. And then we actually operate the company and we get our hands dirty. We have, of course, our teams for that. So our business model is actually, we're in the business of running businesses, really running them and taking them to the next level and also holding them, like Valsoft, like Constellation. We're not flipping this. We also think that founders love to work someone who preserves that legacy, and at least has the intention to work indefinitely and grow this company and operate it indefinitely. And that's what we do.
Got it. Okay. You said something I want to make sure our listeners understand. In the technology world, there's this concept of product led, which is somewhat SaaS specific. So can you describe in layman's terms what you mean by product led?
Yeah. So it's been a bit of a buzzword in the last 2 or 3 years, product led growth, or PLG, definitely in the SaaS world. What it kind of means is that you grow a product not by sales being the main means for growth, but for just simply building a good product. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it should every product should be about. But I mean, there are differences. There are in every world, there are businesses that are primarily marketing and sales driven. And there are other ones where you invest in the product, you really build a top-notch product. And then you build, of course, viral mechanisms in there. You rely on word of mouth. You rely on good pricing. And that's what essentially captures the essence of product-led growth.
Got it. That's helpful. So, I think of, Tesla not really investing any paid advertising up until recently for the first 15 years of its existence, compared with, say, IBM, the famous saying, nothing ever happens until someone makes a sale, the sales led, forget about what we offer. It's really about the salesman.
Yeah, great example. And even in the enterprise world, you see it. I would say Google, for example, is a lot more product led, with Gmail being a tool everybody uses. While Salesforce, for example, would be very sales-led, selling to enterprise. You can't just sign up and be like, oh, I'll have my own Salesforce. For that, you need another CRM. And so I think you see that in every industry.
So if I understand, the business model is very similar to, again, a Constellation or Valsoft, meaning you're buying and holding as opposed to the intent of buying and flipping. So you're buying and holding, but where you would be different than, say, those guys would be more modern. So product led, as not super vertical, more kind of wider applications to what you're doing. Got it. That's super helpful. What are you mentioned, obviously in your case, and again, our listeners, as we talked off before we hit record, our listeners many are not SaaS companies, software as a service companies. But I think I'm asking this question because I want them to really understand your criteria. Every acquirer, whether they're buying SaaS companies or car dealerships, has a criteria or a set of things they look for. So in your case, what are the objective things that you look for in buying a company, like quantitative, objective measurements?
Yeah, great question. And there, to the point you just made, I think a lot of those things, they are agnostic to whether it's software or SaaS or anything else. most of the roll-ups, so serial acquirers who are in a certain industry, and we're in the SaaS industry, but there are similar ones in every single industry. So, for example, a friend of mine, he buys vets, so little local practices for vets, and the same exists for literally every industry. I would argue that it's pretty similar in most cases, if you abstract from like those super specific KPIs. So sure, what you look first is you look at revenue and revenue growth. You look at margins. We look at margins. We look at the ratio of how those margins develop over time. I think all of that is pretty clear, and then of course we drill down further. Okay, what's the retention rate of individual clients? Gross dollar retention, net dollar retention. We look at the churn rate. So why are customers leaving? We look at customer concentration. So are you dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 customers, or do you have 100 customers and there is a low likelihood that all of them will go bust at the same time? Are there any outside risk factors? So regulatory factors, industry dependencies where one supplier contract could just kill your entire business. That's something, again, I think in every industry, those things exist. But then, of course, we also look at the people. We look at what's the style they're running the company. Is there a cultural fit? Are those people where we like to work with, frankly, and would they want to like to work with us? That's equally important. We do reference calls. We do reference calls with customers, with employers, with employees, with former employees, with partners, and just finding out what are they, how honest are all the numbers that were presented and everything. So there's a lot of things we look into to overall just form a picture of what type of companies, how resilient is it, how good is the product. And then last but not least, to mention one last thing, I'm a big fan of dog fooding. Of just dog fooding is actually a tech term from the tech industry, is using a product yourself. The term comes from when you have an unfinished product as a software developer, you still use it yourself because it's dog food, but you have to use it because it's the only way to find out. So what we usually do, and of course that's easier in the software world, is we find one of our companies that actually starts becoming a customer before we acquire a company. And that's the best way to find out, is this really a good product, or would we rather choose something else? And I could go on and on. There are hundreds of factors at the end of the day, hundreds of things. But at the end of the day, I think it boils down to financial numbers, cultural fit, and how good the product is.
I'm really glad you mentioned cultural fit, because that's not one that we hear a lot, at least at this early stage of objectively quantifying. So I just want to dig in there. You mentioned that you call and do reference checks on the founders to try to understand, is this a group of folks that we'd want to work with? And it reminds me of like when you're evaluating a potential employee, and you make them an offer, and oftentimes you'll make the offer obviously contingent on favorable references. In that case, the employee, usually gets to approve the references or even provide them. Is it the same when you're acquiring a company? I mean, do you kind of, and I don't mean this in a pejorative or as an insulting way, but do you sort of go around their back to try to figure out what the real deal is on these guys or gals? Or do you tell them, look, I want to talk to 3 vendors. I want to talk to 3 customers. Are you more explicit, or do you kind of go around their back? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And most of the time we're very upfront. We would say, we would like to talk to your top 5 customers. That's very clear. Like otherwise, people always cherry pick. And this way we get the top 5 customers. Or what were the last 2 employees that left your team? We would like to talk to them. That's an exception, though, only if there's some red flags in the cultural diligence. That's one we wouldn't do in a normal check. But also employees, of course, is a sensitive topic. Very often, the founder doesn't want his or her team to know. So, of course, then we cannot talk to the employees. But there are other ways to find this out. Things like Glassdoor, review platforms, those sorts of things. So also a bit of an advice, make sure that you invest as a seller, you invest some time and actually some favorable reviews of employees, of partners, of customers online, because that goes into the mindset of an acquirer and will, of course, shape our image. But there are, I'll be frank, there are cases where we're like, there's something weird over here, and it might be kind of a red flag. Let's, through an introduction, talk to this person. And yes, then we wouldn't tell them. But that's kind of what a reputation of people is. And by the way, we encourage the same thing to do the other way around. One thing I always say to every founder is, you can call every single person who runs any of our 20 portfolio companies or the seller who sold to us. And sure, I know that some are more favorable to us than others. And if you would ask me for 3, I would give them maybe 3 specific ones. But I'm always very upfront. It's like, hey, do your reference checks, vice versa as well, because there are acquirers, for example, who don't pay they're notorious for not paying earnouts. They always kind of sneak things around. And then later when it comes to earnout payday, they're dodging it. And I think we've developed a really thorough reputation of sticking to our word of, unless, something goes terribly wrong, we set people up for success and not for failure when it comes to earnout. And I want people to hear that from others, not from me. And so it should go both ways.
Let's talk about the numbers for a second. So how are you capitalized? The company SaaS Group, of which you are a co-founder and partner, I'm assuming you've kicked in some of your own net worth into this business. Maybe talk a little bit about where the money's come from. Have you got investors or bank debt? What's the capital structure?
Yeah, so I started it with my own money. Then I did a little bit of an angel round, a friends and family round. Mainly to get a few great people on board. And actually, a lot of those people are working at SaaS Group now, which is really cool. It's always good if someone starts investing money and then shortly after says, hey, this is so cool. Can I contribute? And some of the best people we have are among those people. And then I started very early on adding debt to it because in the business we're in with recurring revenue, it's fairly easy to get debt. And I found some good banks who understood that it's equal. It has an equal risk profile to a rented apartment building, which is kind of what SaaS is. And just very lately, we've done earlier this year a small institutional round. And we wanted to wait with that as long as possible because, of course, money or shares you give away at your earlier stage, you dilute more. Now we've already grown to a decent size. We were able to keep dilution lower, but we wanted to have an institutional investor as well because just I think like a lot of founders out there have noticed, if you have someone whom you're also responsible, like someone whom you feel responsible to, it's a pretty good thing for your own corporate governance. You start documenting things a little better. You start having discussions, which otherwise as a founder you might just decide without much thinking, and it forces you to defend in a positive way certain decisions to investors, even if they're like just a tiny minority. And I've always found that has made me a better entrepreneur than if I just do something myself and I'm basically, I don't have to answer to anyone. So
you mentioned debt for a moment. I'd love to just follow up on the bank debt. So when a bank loans you money to acquire a company, is that collateralized, or
yes,
is the collateral effectively the company you're buying? In the event that the bank loan goes bad, that bank can go after that company, or is it SaaS Group, the parent company?
In our case, is SaaS Group the parent company, but both possibilities exist. PEs often do it on a deal by deal basis. Of course, they pay higher interest rates because the risk of one individual deal is always higher than the risk of a portfolio. In our case, we have much more favorable rates. But of course, if something goes terribly bust, well, it's our money. But I think that's what it's designed for. And also, we're a serial acquirer who does a lot of acquisitions, but very small acquisitions. So even if one goes bust, that wouldn't kill the company. But in the end, it's a matter of responsibility. It's not something we're shoving off to third-party investors. But if we do a bad deal, it hurts all of us. And I think that's the way it should be.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's a whole debate in the industry of, among our listeners as well, as to sort of like, how should they go about finding a buyer for their company?
Yeah.
The old tried and true method to do that, of course, is to hire an M&A professional and you run like a broad auction, and you get lots of folks interested and so forth. There's some sentiment that depending on how broad the auction are, some buyers will walk away and say, "Look, I don't want to participate in this giant beauty contest and that's just designed to gin up the value." So I'm out effectively. Where do you land as acquirers on participating in an auction?
That's a good question. I mean, we most of our deals are broker led, because as you say, the common wisdom is that you go and work with a broker. Of course, we prefer a one-on-one conversation, and we also can't say that those people get worse prices, but it's a different skill set. So I think both have their merit. If you're a financially savvy seller who has a good advisor on the side, I don't know, who preps the books, who advises you in the background, I think nothing speaks against doing this process yourself. You have a much whenever you do a process yourself, you get an unfiltered view. Especially if you, for example, want to stay in a company and you want to make sure that your baby and your business, like a business you started, is a bit like your baby. At least that's what's always been for me. You want to have your baby in the right hands, and a broker can be a filter. The broker wants a deal, might push you into the wrong directions. At least bad brokers do. Of course, good brokers, they help you structure things. They can mediate conflicts. They bring both sides some sense of realism. So I think there's no right or wrong in either way. But I wouldn't just naturally go and hire someone. I would also just have colloquial conversations with a few people. And it can be a lot easier if you don't involve a broker and talk to 20 potential acquirers. It's just super stressful. While if you do a one-on-one and you get the right price, it's much less stressful. You pick the right person, and a lot speaks for doing this. And some of our most successful sellers have actually opted for that route.
Yeah, we're big believers in using M&A professionals on this show, primarily, to provide, to create competitive tension, but also to provide that emotional filter for the founder to try to mitigate the kind of highs and lows of an M&A transaction, and to your point, try to insulate them from any conflict, because in many cases they're going on to work for these businesses for some time. And we found M&A professionals can be really
good ones definitely do that, and that's being a somewhat neutral party in the middle can be tremendously helpful, and so there are a lot of great ones out there with whom we love to work with, because they know they're exactly that.
How do you find deals? How do you find companies to buy?
Well, brokers is one source. Obviously, we want to make ourselves known to all the brokers out there who have SaaS businesses between 1 and 10 million in revenue. It's like, hey, we're here, we're SaaS Group, we're acquiring, we have a big war chest. That outreach is something we constantly do. But then it's also getting in touch with individual companies. We have built up a great database of SaaS companies. We're contacting basically cold outreach founders, but we also have a lot of social media content. My colleague Dirk Zalmer, he's one of the most followed people in SaaS metrics. He has a SaaS newsletter, and so we publish a lot of stuff, particularly on SaaS metrics, on SaaS M&A market, those sorts of things, to just provide good content and be helpful way before we actually are in touch with people.
Got it. That makes full sense for sure. And when you structure a deal, again, our listeners would be familiar with the private equity model, where the private equity group will buy 60% of the business and encourage the founder to roll 40%. And the view is that, hey, we'll co-invest, and 5-7 years later, we'll sell this puppy, and the amount that you roll will be worth more than what you got on your first tranche of value. How is your structure different? Like, what would a typical structure look like for you when you buy a business?
So we believe that the structure should follow what the founder really wants with his or her life. That's probably the most important thing, is that every founder comes to us with something where there's usually a life-changing event. It's like, I want to sell this because, or some thinking. And there are some people who've been coming to us, and it's like, hey, I'm really literally burned out and I cannot do this any longer. And I don't want to do a transition period. And within a month or 5 months, I have to be out. And there are other ones who are like, let's play it by ear. Let's try it. I'm not sick of my business, but I want to have someone on my side to help me. And those people then in some cases stay on for years, or they're still with us. Others come and say, I'm going to do this for 2 years, and we're going to structure an earnout and buy the whole company, but there's a big chunk coming after 2 years, depending on what the results are then. And the structure, so there's a long-winded answer, but the structure has to follow the life of the founder first and foremost. So if someone is like, here's the key, then we need to pay them all cash, and we will. Of course, it will depress your cash price a bit if you're in that situation. Of course, you get more if you're like, hey, I'm going to commit against my business plan. I'm going to execute my business plan myself for the next 2 to 3 years. But both of those are workable. There's one thing, though, we always acquire 100%. That's just our model. It makes the whole governance a lot easier. And we're also not flipping the company. The PE model with 60% and 40% later only works if you want to flip your company later. Also, as a founder, you need to know you're not making that decision later to flip. Like, this might be a competitor buying it, just killing your brand, laying off all your employees, whatever. You're not in control here anymore. If you sell to someone who is a buy and hold player, likelihood is very high that your business will operate for the next 20, 30 years. To me, that's always been a great motivation. Like, my first business I started, Cedo.com, it still runs. It's still the biggest marketplace of domains out there. I cycle by their office every other day. It still makes me feel good. It's like, it's really weird, but it's like, that's worth to me more than the money I got after the exit.
Yeah, well, it's like your child.
Yeah.
You get to see them grow up and mature, and your relationship changes with them as adults, but that doesn't mean you don't love being with them still, for sure. It makes a total sense. So talk to me about the earnouts piece. So you buy 100% of the business. Most of our listeners have heard this kind of idea of an earnout. They've also heard the horror stories, as you alluded to earlier. So how do you structure an earnout? Is it tied to revenue, tied to EBITDA, gross margin? And what governance do you put in place to ensure that the founder is not taken advantage of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, an earnout is really a science in itself. And first of all, I think it's important that, as I said before, that the earnout aligns with the timeline of the founder. If we see that the founder really wants to get out, makes no sense to have a 4-year earnout. On the other hand, if the founder has super stable life and is like, hey, I just want to take some money behind the firewall, you should go a little longer. You can do both. You can do revenue, you can EBITDA, you can do some extra targets like integration targets, certain achievement into, we're building this additional product, we're moving into this additional industry, we're doing a certain technical refactoring. Sometimes we have a whole list of things after the due diligence, which we also include in an earnout, at least with a small portion. So that we're saying, hey, your earnout might be 2 million, and 200,000 of that is that, you get your your billing system in order, which is really kind of a mess, and that you move your payment to Stripe to make this like super seamless, and those sorts of things, those kind of housekeeping projects. And then the founder knows like not everything is at risk, but I really should do those things. And it makes it the more important than if you just say that the person has to do that. Then, of course, the majority is always revenue and profitability. And there, of course, it's important to put a few things into a contract, but it's even more important to have an honest conversation first where you want to go with this business. You want to reduce costs. You want to put it up for growth. And it really depends on the business what is best. We see some businesses which are totally bloated. We got to get rid of some costs. We see a lot of other businesses which are amazingly efficient. We've bought, just as an example, we've bought 2 businesses where there was one single guy making 2 million in revenues, in annual recurring software revenue, just because they were so super efficient and just setting every process up for automation. And so very different business. There, of course, is not about cost saving. There are no costs. There, it's all about, okay, how do we make sure that we broaden this business from a one-person business and make it grow by actually adding a ton of costs? And so every case is different, but it's really important to just have a super honest conversation, align incentives, and then have a proper contract in place to execute on those in the following years. And also be generous in the end. We tend to be like, if, someone misses it by a little bit, we're like, you did a great job. Come on. It's like, it's 100%, although, technically you might have missed it. I think it pays in the long run.
Yeah. One of the things that we've heard in the way of horror stories is that a founder will take a revenue target and then they won't be able to get the budget that they need to reach the revenue target. Do you guarantee, marketing spend in an earnout contract, or guarantee a certain budget that they would have in order to hit a top line number?
Yeah, that's why it should always be a mix of revenue and profitability or profit margin. You cannot hit a certain revenue target if you are starving a company. That's why those things always need to be together, but also we're very upfront whether someone needs to get an additional investment from us, or basically just has to, as long as the founder maintains a certain profit margin, he or she is fine to spend the rest on revenue growth. It's usually the case at SaaS Group. We're very upfront with that. And then there is no budget discussion. Like you're kind of a bootstrapper like you were before, just with a lot more help and advice, and you're free to take that advice and our help, but you also can do your own thing because, you're on your earnout. We trust you. But then it's up to us to show that we can deliver value. And that's kind of where the whole SaaS Group model then really comes into play. And it's also very different to private equity. We have like a bunch of central teams in marketing, in developer operations, in analytics, in AI. So lots of super specialized topics that can develop, that can deliver a lot of value to the businesses we've acquired, so that most of the times the founders say, "Oh wow, I didn't know that that's possible," and they're more likely to hit their earnouts after they've kind of discovered what they can do compared to the time before.
One of the things that keeps sort of coming in and out of my head as we have this conversation is the listener of this show who feels like their business is not perfect, right? Like, you described in the beginning your criteria for picking a business to buy, revenue, at least a couple million in recurring revenue, good margin, good retention rate, great reputation in the marketplace, no unhappy former employees. I was kind of listening to this description going like, this is the perfect business. Like, first of all, why would anybody sell this thing? And 2, this is like impossible. What would you say to somebody listening and saying, sure, Tim, like you live in fantasy land, like no business is this good. And I have a real business and it's not all perfect. Can they sell that thing, or do they have to fix every sort of problem before they come talk to you?
Yeah, thanks for addressing that, because I definitely didn't want to make the impression that everybody business has to be perfect. Of course, also none of the businesses we buy is perfect in every aspect. no, you don't have to fix everything. What you have to, of course, you have to adjust your prices potentially. What I see very often is that people are like, oh, I have this revenue and I look at some public revenue multiples and now I want that. And of course, in a small business, you have obviously certain problems. Every business has certain problems. And that's fine, because also part of our upside is if we fix those problems, then we can also get a superior return. And so actually, we sometimes like businesses which have just this one problem. I'll give an example. So that one business I just talked about, we had a business that did 2 million in revenue, called Pre-Render. It's an SEO, so a search engine optimization tool for large websites. And it was 2 million, one guy, super impressive technical product. The only one problem was that he spent half of his money on AWS, so the Amazon Web Hosting Services. And it was a very lean setup in terms of the people you needed, but you could replicate the same setup by just buying servers, good old-fashioned servers, and spend 10% of that. And then you hire one additional person, and then you're still at 80% savings. And that's exactly what we did. So even that was a perfectly technical business. The problem was kind of the setup, but a problem is always an opportunity. And we find that with every business. Every business has some things where it's great and other businesses where it's not. And as long as the pricing is realistic and there's an honest conversation how we fix those issues, ideally together. Like in this case, for example, we did the project together. The former founder learned a lot. We learned a lot. It's a great business these days. Has quadrupled in revenue, but it's also super profitable. And so that's the type of approach we have. Is like no problem is a problem you can't fix.
Our listeners run the gamut. Again, some are SaaS companies, many are not. And I asked this question with a view that it'll probably alienate some of our listeners. But the question I have is, how do you think about valuation? Of course, SaaS companies, unlike retail or service businesses, generally garner these multiples on revenue as opposed to EBITDA. But I'd be curious in your case, how do you think about valuation? What are the ranges that you pay, and sort of, what would drive that range to the upper end versus to the lower end?
It's a broad range. So I mean, EBITDA multiples, we at the end we also pay on EBITDA multiples, and those are probably somewhat comparable to other ones, a little higher than e-commerce, for example, or other areas, because there's recurring revenue which gives a certain security. But then if you put it back on on EBITDA, then actually the multiples are somewhat similar. If we look at revenue, we've paid everything from 0.5x revenue up to 10x revenue. So it's a huge range. Majority is probably, I would say, in the 2 to 3x ARR range. That's where the bulk of the businesses, us and other serial acquirers in the SaaS space, are buying.
And in the case that you paid half a year's recurring revenue, why did that business trade at such a low multiple? And in the case you paid 10 times, why did it trade at such a high multiple?
So in that one case, in half 0.5, the company was bankrupt. Very, very simple. It was in a Chapter 11 proceeding, and we picked it out of there and got it back on track. And it's now humming along and doing well. And in the case of a 10x, it's actually a Canadian company. It was still very small, but on a very, very promising trajectory with growth over 100% per year. And so it was almost like a VC case, but in an industry we liked a lot. We loved the founders. We loved the product, like everything fit. And we're like, we need to have this, and it's doing super well. It was a good purchase, very strategically fitting. But in this case, also the absolute amount of revenue was fairly small, so the 10x were okay. We've been growing into that valuation.
Yeah. The two to three times ARR for, again, our non-SaaS listeners, that stands for annual recurring revenue. That would be the sort of normal range for a smallish SaaS company. When you're thinking about, what does that translate into on a multiple of normalized EBITDA? Like if you're paying 2 to 3 times ARR, what would that generally be on a multiple of EBITDA?
Somewhere between 5 and 10x usually on EBITDA. But very often also after certain improvements. So it happens, for example, that we buy a company that has zero profit, but we still pay a 2x on the revenue. But then we need to have very specific plans in place. How do we get to that? It is at the end an effective 5 to 10x EBITDA within 12 months, so within a relatively short time span, which is possible in software because the software revenue is pretty sticky. And so if we do the right measures, the right cost savings with the particular expertise we have in SaaS, then very often it's doable.
I want to end with a relatively controversial topic in the M&A world, but I know it's one you've tackled and thought about, I'm sure, in your work as an acquirer, and that's retrading. So when the topic of retrading comes up among our audience, we can categorize it into sort of two buckets. There's kind of legitimate retrading, which happens when an acquirer discovers something that is material and was not disclosed, right? Or they missed their targets during diligence and it's a giant miss. And so there's retrading involved. There's also illegitimate retrading, in my view, which is retrading because you can. Because as an acquirer, you look into the whites of the eyes of the entrepreneur and you know they bought the boat, you know they bought the ski chalet, you know they've told their spouse, you know they've told their employees, and you just do it because you can. And I'm not saying you do it, Tim. I'm saying
it's done.
They do it. Acquirers do it. I just love to know your philosophy as it relates to illegitimate retrading, and have you ever been tempted to do it? If so, under what conditions? Do you know acquirers who do it? Just walk me through your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, on let me say on the personal level, I'm a big fan of living below your means. So I think you're much happier in life if you always just spend a fraction what you can, no matter what. So I would really strongly advise against, even in your mind, acquiring the ski chalet or the boat or something that will just make your life miserable because things don't work out then in the end, and then you're under a lot of pressure. And just I would say as general advice, it's at least how I live my life. But that having said, so ideally, of course, as a founder, you never get into this position, whether mentally nor through actual business means. Of course, it's very unfortunate if your business is basically a few days before bankruptcy, then you might have no other choice. And then if the other side finds out, that's really bad. I'm obviously very against retrading. The philosophy we have is an LOI is a handshake agreement, and sure, if we see something material, then we would have a conversation. But more likely, we've then said, we just don't think it fits. Very often culture. We just don't think, we'll be happy together for the next couple of years, or your employees will be happy. You have a very different philosophy. Let's just call this off. So we don't even get into this discussion of retrading. We've had a few cases where we also said, hey, really, we can do it, but we have to pay 30% less. I hate doing those things. Sometimes we still do it because it's at least something we offer, but I usually don't feel good with it. And I don't like it.
What would cause you to have to retrade to that extent?
Well, a lot of things you mentioned where there's a miss in the numbers. But often, I think, let's face it, there were at least one or two cases where we didn't do our homework before. We went into a deal. Sometimes you're pressured into a deal. The broker says, oh, yeah, you can late to the process. You have to put an LOI. You have to put an LOI. Then you start actually getting yourself familiarized with the company, and you discover, this product is really shitty, or those people are weird. And then it's like, I feel like it's kind of our fault, but on the other side, it's like we didn't really have time before that, or something else. And it's a very unfortunate position. But then again, I think we'd rather say, hey, we just don't think it fits. But it doesn't feel good either, because an LOI should also be an LOI in a way that we want to do the deal, and then just both sides didn't do the homework. So we actually prefer to spend a little bit more time before an LOI, then put an LOI there, mean it, and the DD is really just confirmatory. And in 80% of the cases, that's how we do it. But there are those 20% cases where the process just doesn't align with how we like to do it. And then sometimes it goes havoc. I think that's the M&A world.
Yeah, just a couple of acronyms there. LOI, letter of intent.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned that up front. DD, due diligence. So those are a couple of the terms you'll run into for sure. Tim, wear your entrepreneur hat for a moment. I know you play both roles, both entrepreneur as well as acquirer. So just if you can wear your entrepreneur hat for just a moment, what advice would you give a fellow entrepreneur, an EO member, someone in your forum, on how to avoid retrading?
So one is what I mentioned is don't mentally already spend the money. Like, don't be sure about this. Always assume the worst. The second thing is understand that the period of the due diligence and the negotiation is equally important business-wise than all the months before. So you don't empty your entire sales funnel to get the LOI over the finishing line. You might empty the entire sales funnel before the real contract is signed, but that period, which is usually 3 to 4 months, can even be longer, is equally important as the time before. So you better make sure that you perform every quarter, and you rather reinstall confidence in the buyer, because nothing else is more reaffirming to the buyers than if you beat your numbers and you keep churning out with good news, good product news, good hires, good customer wins, whatever, during this time. And the last thing is really during LOI, I would ask is like, for you, dear acquirer, this LOI, is this a handshake agreement? Do you promise we're going to keep this unless, you find skeletons in the closet? Is this what you mean? And, handshake on this. Or is this for you kind of a moving target? And I would just ask. And sure, that person can lie in your face and still trade, but I would just ask them.
Yeah, I love this sort of putting it on the table. Yeah. So at least the other side knows you're savvy to the game and say, hey, look, I'm not interested in playing that game. So I love that advice, and of course, most importantly, make sure you hit your numbers during diligence, which is a biggie. I'm super grateful for your candor. I find you to be an incredible, candid, open book. Maybe it's the Northern European in you or something that's coming through. It's very straightforward, which I really appreciate.
For better or worse.
I'm grateful for you just being really straight with our listeners as to what you look for, what you don't, and when it works well. If folks want to reach out to you, Tim, what's the best way to do that? Is there is it LinkedIn, or what's the best way to connect?
Yeah, LinkedIn is great. It's Tim Schumacher, so I'm not sure if it's coming through here because I see it's SCHUMACHER. And or we'll Tim, or super simple, Tim at SaaS.group. Email, LinkedIn, both. And I'm usually pretty responsive.
You're not hard to find.
No, I'm not hard to find. And I'm also not hard to chase down. I take pride in answering every email, even if it might be just with one of my many templates, for example, from sellers or stuff. But I take pride in answering every single email. So.
Awesome. And we'll put Tim's LinkedIn and contact information in the show notes at builttosell.com. Tim, thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me.